Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Humans and Digital, Understanding Connected Experiences. For those of you who don't know us, Phase 2's vision is to create digital experience that advances the human experience. We're excited today to share some of our thoughts on connected experience and how it can help your organization. Our guest speaker today is Emily White, our Vice President of Marketing at Phase 2. I'm going to turn things over to her to get us started.
Great, thank you, Chris. And thank you all for attending. Before we begin, you've probably been inundated for, 100 webinars at this point from probably really talented folks. And you've probably also seen a ton of numbers and stats and graphs around connectivity and customer experience and what that means. While we strongly believe in data-driven decisions at Phase 2, we also understand that especially for highly regulated industries like financial services, government agencies, and healthcare, it can be difficult to know where to begin and who is ultimately accountable for this connectedness that everyone talks about. And that's really Phase 2's sweet spot, where the systems and processes and people intersect. So why am I the person to be talking to you about this? My career started out as a storyteller for film and television. And after years in production, I realized that what I really cared about was why people behave the way they do and how, as a brand, we can speak to consumers in a manner that changes how they live and work day to day. So from there, I spent time in consumer market research, e-commerce, and PR, building and realizing the importance of brand safety. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the term, it basically means let your outside match your inside. So the same philosophy can really be applied to connected experience. So people talk about connected in casual conversation, but can we really dial in on what that means? And I think that that's what we're going to try and do today. Right, so at the most fundamental level, I am not really a fan of super text-heavy slides, but this is an exception. We took a stab at what this might mean, right? Connected experience is creating that unified view of a customer, regardless of the touch point on and offline, and seamlessly delivering a contextually relevant, personalized experience on that channel. So think about that for a minute. I'm going to pause for a second for all you digital experts out there. On and offline, seamless, relevant. This is a really practical definition that when we break it down, it gives us some guidance. So does it really matter, right? How much does this matter really in our day-to-day work, right? This isn't big news. Success of your company is determined as much by the experience that a customer receives as the actual product that you're selling. We all get this statement. It's why you're here today. Your company is probably not offering products and services that no one has ever seen before. But what you do offer is relationship and service coupled with a necessary and relevant product suite. So at the core, you already believe this and hold this point of view. But again, that outside has to match our inside. So for example, if you're a bank, if somebody comes to you and decides they're going to open a checking account, that is not what differentiates you from your competitors. That's not why they choose you. But how you do it and the impression that the customer walks away with, that is what changes the game. So then on the next slide, you see big number stats. And I just talked to you about this up at the beginning that you've probably seen lots of stats as you've been in your Zooming webinar times here, but I promised I wasn't going to throw too many of them. But my first stat of only 2 is that by the end of this crazy year of 2020, we still expect that worldwide we will reach 13.5 billion connected devices. So I've been harping a little bit on this on and offline and giving emphasis there. So why do I even share this stat about devices? The reason why is because it is about brands and customers interacting anytime and anywhere with the ability to improve our lives. So then what do? We got to make a big bet, right? So my second and hopefully last stat that I'm going to speak to is that when people make this big bet, their average revenue growth rate increases by 23%. That's like no joke on a business standpoint, especially in these times when business is harder to get, customers are harder to retain every day, right? But those experience-driven businesses are retaining more customers. And on top of that, we are able to extract more value from those customers and therefore make more money, right? So what can companies do as they approach this pursuit, right? How do they make this big bet? Frankly, the reason why I'm even doing this webinar is that we need to extend our gaze for guidance, not only keeping the eye on our current immediate competitor within our industry, but let's look at brands who are setting the expectation for the customer on our behalf, whether we like it or not. So those industries like media and food and beverage have already jumped on this train, visibly capturing the attention and changing every landscape in the process. So when we look at signals of connectedness, how can you visibly see this in the market? We have some ideas. Okay, so how you recognize this, I hope that you view your experiences a little bit differently after today when you look at people's digital products and presence. So 3 ways you can spy that a brand is moving towards a connected experience is personalization, brand safety, and persistent memory. In personalization, that's answering the question of how well do you know me for the customer. It's not just a technical implementation to connect tools and channels. It must be a deep understanding of how customers view themselves, what they do and what they need, oftentimes before they know they need it. So personalization is not simply a technical overlay or a product like Aqua Lift, right? It is a way of thinking. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about personalization in the last year or two. It's been a very popular thing, especially for digital properties. In fact, one of my colleagues did a great webinar about it a couple months ago. Her name is Annie Stone. I'll send you the link afterwards if you all want to go back to that webinar. It's a great presentation about what personalization means, right? So the second piece is around brand safety. And I mentioned this a little bit at the top of the webinar, is do I trust you to be a part of my life and conversation? This is what the customer is asking. Do I trust you to be a part of my life and the conversation? So yes, trust is a finicky thing with consumers, right? The best way to increase it is through consistency, predictability, and transparency of what you're trying to do as a brand. So don't confuse this with boring or stodgy. Consistency and predictability opens the doors to create, to surprise, and to take more risks because you're on a solid foundation. And I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. Last thing, being persistent memory. And that's when a consumer asks, how much do you remember about me? And do I have to repeat myself 20 times with the same information? Any type of annoyance, inconvenience, and difficulty in the experience breaks that trust. And they assume that the brand is unsafe to give their information to. So it's really important that you do that in strategic times. So some pitfalls to address, right? So I'm really excited to show this slide because I think that these are things that are on people's minds a lot, right? And thankfully, I don't have to tackle these mammoths on my own. I have privacy and I have security people who do this kind of stuff. You will see in webinars upcoming in the next couple months, you will see people tackle privacy security here. So thankfully, I don't have to carry that burden too much. But what I do want to say is that a big challenge for any regulated industry is managing the nuance of connecting multiple visible channels seamlessly while conveying adherence to privacy concerns and the appropriate usage of customer data and security. So this is a barrier that absolutely has to be solved in order for you to be able to get creative and in order for the customer to have a safe, personalized, and memorable experience. So the one that I really want to focus on this slide is really around miscategorization. And it sits outside of technical considerations and challenges. But the risk of miscategorization may not just inconvenience the consumer, but it can drive them farther away from loyalty. Or what can it do? It can cause them to switch to another service or brand, which is ultimately what we do not want them to do. For an example, I saw somebody on LinkedIn the other day ask why a brand didn't understand when he made a purchase from the company. So his personalized experience profile changed, but the brand did not keep up with him. So as a result, he went, and the example was actually a lamp, right? So he went to a furniture store website and he bought this lamp. And once he purchased it, the next 2-3 days, they kept pushing him the same ads for what? That exact lamp that he already purchased. So that's something that is a big fail on the part of the brand. Or on top of that, have you ever been delivered a promotional product that is intended to be the exact thing that you need to make a decision? On a really serious note, how troubling it must feel if you received samples of baby formula and you are a single woman or you're a couple who chooses not or cannot have children. Talk about mistrust in the market for how your data is being used. Do they really know you and understand what you need? So ensuring trust is not just earned from the beginning, but it's essential that we pay attention and don't lose it on something insensitive or just overlooking how we are using data. So I have some lessons that I've learned. And I really think that companies can take a lead in their industry by following the expectations that are set by other industries. You may roll your eyes to hear that I follow brands like Starbucks or Netflix as a gold standard. You roll your eyes because they seem to be too far ahead of what you're able to do, not because I'm wrong. The gold standard is to create these seamless experiences. So let me break a couple of these down so you see what I mean. The first example that I have in this really wild infographic is around a campaign that we did for Northwell Health called Kill the Clipboard. It stems from an idea that doctors and nurses need to get away from chasing down paper documents in order to have a knowledgeable expert interaction with a patient. So it really was the epitome of a disconnected experience. So how in healthcare can you manage a connected experience when you have a ton of regulation, lots of privacy concerns, and also like managing a person's personal identity is really important, right? That we take care of that from the human side. So what we did and what Northwell did was they took some uncomfortable steps to determine what really needed to be done, not assuming that they had the answer. So they conducted something called ride-alongs. This is a way for decision makers to see firsthand what the patient experience is like step by step. So including implementers as a part of this process, it's easier to poke holes in where you're missing, right? So unexpected ideas can come up and really be game changers. So important questions like, what's your favorite song? Sounds seemingly random. Why is it important? They found out that somebody wanted to be comforted by certain songs or certain artists being played before they have a serious surgery, and it changes a mindset. Or while you await the results of a test. No one would have ever thought of that if they didn't ride along and have a conversation with the patient throughout their experience. And then from there, Northwell was able to build a service-oriented architecture, an application layer that pulls data from different systems for booking and billing, authentication, CRM to compile a holistic view of the patient and to communicate with one another so that information gets passed easily. So not just enabling the patient a more customized experience, but also lets doctors and nurses be more confident in their skills through reliability and up-to-date information. So this is a really interesting example of how you can connect in a highly regulated industry. But I want to move on and talk about like Spotify next. And the reason why I want to talk about them is I want to talk about their seamlessness. They are the epitome of the everywhere brand. I think I talked to you all at the very beginning of this about people being able to interact with a brand anytime and anywhere, and how that becomes really important, right? So this is a great example of anywhere. They run on refrigerators, but I don't want you to see this as a gimmick. The kitchen in a home is full of habitual data that can help you refine profiles of people. So how do they do that so seamlessly? The secret is they have an auto-propagating design system behind all of their products that is really robust. What does that mean for not all the techies in our audience today? Is that their repeatable components are flexible enough to be applied through multiple channels. And their company strategy is in sync between brand marketing, between digital and IT. So the technical decisions aren't as hard as the people-centered decisions that have to be made in the background. So picking up where you left off, you can listen to Spotify in your car, and then when you turn it on in your office, it cues up to the same song, if everyone has noticed that. That's one of the great value props of Spotify. And then if you're in the kitchen, it can also translate to picking up right where you left off if you decide you got to take a shower. So we at Phase 2 often help organizations adopt something called a storefront workshop model. So if we consider your company's website to be the brand's storefront, along with any walk-in retail physical locations, the processes, product, and people connectivity happens behind the scenes in something we call the workshop. The workshop is where you can be constantly evolving, you can be trying new things, revisiting data for new findings. But the beauty is the storefront never sees or feels that work. To them, it's a delightful user experience. It's not easy to simplify or be invisible. But in Spotify's case, being able to pick up where you left off from your car to your kitchen to your office to the shower is really what makes them really successful. So the next example I have is the anytime example, right? And that's Starbucks, right? So Starbucks has dipped its toe into many areas for experimentation. They are a great example of the storefront workshop model. So one could argue about their successes, you know, pumpkin spice latte, anyone, and their failures, which are an after hours model they went for. They've also struggled with menu bloat. But the one thing that's pretty undeniable about Starbucks is the connected experience that they've orchestrated. So they have found ways around what started to trip them up. They didn't have a perfect model from the very beginning, but they did recognize that the consumer was not always able to spend 10 to 15 minutes through a snaking line, sometimes out the door for a cup of coffee. They did a couple things to combat that. One, they sought out drive-through opportunities. Totally makes sense, right? We've all seen it, we love it. They've also allowed for pre-order through a Starbucks app. Mind you, even in highly regulated industries, Bank of America is doing this for ATM withdrawals. So it's not impossible for highly regulated industries to do things like this. Moving new drinks to a seasonal model helped them kind of pare down their menu, and it allowed for testing around demand without tarnishing their brand or making things confusing on an operational level. They've also have saved order history. So you remember me talking about persistent memory? I'd love to say that it's easy for me to remember your colleague's order, but we know that somebody's favorite grande, non-fat, no whip latte with 1 peppermint and 1 pump vanilla syrup is really difficult to remember. But if you've placed the order before, it's much easier to go to your recent history and just add that to your order, right? So that's a really comforting thing. Also, finally, they know my birthday, right? You get stars for interacting with the brand, reviews, surveys, and purchases. So when we look at gamification, it is a way to understand the data and the profile of the consumer, but also saying we know that knowing you is valuable. People shouldn't have to give up their information for free. They should have something as a reward. So that's an important thing to be thinking about. So through these 3 examples, from healthcare to entertainment to food and beverage, many of you may be saying things like, none of this is something that I can do right now. I'm so far behind. So if we go to how you might be able to get started, is a brand application audit, real customer modeling, starting at the edge, and then experimenting and refining. And I'll tell you a little bit about how to do that. If you feel like this is something that you're just starting to explore, there are ways to take what I call the baby steps forward, right? You're probably saying, okay, we get it. These folks have it all together. What can I do to leverage these learnings and take my own steps that are right for my company and our customers? So for the brand application audit is just taking a look at how you show up in all your channels. So find out. This is about curiosity and about spotting the differences and making sure that they're intentional and collaborative. Or have things been owned by different authors and then written in a way that feels like it's not the same group, right? So those are some things to explore. Also in customer modeling, finding out who your customer really is, not demographically only, but also habitually, like what are their habits? Then you can attract more people like them and leverage circles of influence, right? Starting at the edges. This is something that's very tactical, but often people will start at the center, right? So starting at the edges means discover what happens before a customer interacts with you, what triggers their interaction with you, and then what happens when they exit. So if you tackle this data problem from the edges, it will help you make decisions in the customer journey mapping while they are interacting with your digital property. So being able to understand their motivations before and after their experience can help you understand and architect what they need to be doing while they're with you. So finally, the last one, this is something you probably hear a lot, but I'm gonna say it again, is be fearless and inspired in your workshop. So the beauty of this is it doesn't always have to be pushed to your storefront. You can be inspired in your workshop, work on things internally, and then send those proven experiments to the storefront, keeping that consumer trust intact. All right. So here's my feeling about this, about connectivity. This is going to be our last slide. Instead of digital transformation, which is about as buzzy as it gets, it insinuates a catch-up or a big giant project. Why don't we understand that these shifts towards connectivity are continual and the new normal in business? The reality is we're never done and we're never going to be. This is an evolution. So borrowing the term from a conversation with some of my friends over at Gartner, digital transformation is now continuous next. But this is what's most important to remember when pursuing connected experiences, is that adaptation in this market is a requirement. It's not a luxury. It's not only for those who feel like they're swimming in piles of budget to be able to figure this stuff out. It really is a requirement at every level. Also putting one foot in front of the other. It's never complete. You don't want to be. This is something that as the world changes, you want to be evolving with it. Also, listen first, then speak. I couldn't have said it better than on the slide. And be fearlessly dynamic and actively engaged in creating experiences. So that is what I wanted to chat with you all today about. I would love to swap war stories. I would love to have continuous conversation around it. And I'm happy to answer a couple of questions today now if you have them, or you can feel free to hit me up after. My contact info is up here on the slide. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was really helpful. Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Absolutely. And Emily, I think we do have a few questions. I'm going to actually let you read them and then answer them in real time.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I did see a couple come through. That is awesome. Okay, here we go. I'll tackle, do I get to choose which one do I tackle first? Okay, so this one is from Ryan. It says, with the new COVID-19 reality all businesses find themselves in, which I think we alluded to a little bit, what advice would you give to brands who are already late adopters to the idea of connected experience. And I think we talked about this a little bit. We touched on it earlier with the examples, but the key is going to be the anytime, anywhere idea. So if you're a late adopter, the beauty is that you can audit and see where your audience wants to interact with you. This isn't about push notifications or SMS or giving people like chat bots. Really, this is about how does the consumer want to reach you. I think that is, to me, like the biggest piece of advice is around audience first. So I hope that was helpful. The next one is from Jennifer. And she says, she asks, how important is creating a culture of content in positioning your brand for success for a connected experience? Content's a huge piece of this, actually, and where a lot of brands miss the mark here is, unfortunately, a focus on an over focus on efficiency. So there are a lot of brands out there that you'll probably see that connect a lot of their channels together, and then they copy paste content. And I think the culture of content in positioning is that understanding the channels all have their own purpose. And while they still need to follow brand guidelines, things need to not be on autopilot. Like, you need to make sure that the message that you're giving on mobile is, while it is brand appropriate, it is not the same message that you're going to give at a retail in-person store, right? So I think that that's incredibly important to take our content managers and creators off of autopilot and make sure that they understand that there are nuances for each channel. Let's see. Do we have time for one more, Chris?
We do, absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay. Tim. Okay, so Tim asked, what part of an organization do you feel is ultimately responsible for ensuring a connected experience? This is a really interesting one because organizations are all set up a little bit differently. I think in my past life and in currently, that digital strategy is really the core of understanding what I call the forest for the trees, or seeing how all the channels fit together. However, I will say, not a lot of brands necessarily have an individual digital strategy or strategy department. If you do, lucky you. Very excited for you. If you don't, really, the marketing group is a great place to fall back to ask advice for each of the teams. So whether you have an engineering team, content team, design team, they all should be working together. But really, when it comes to the leadership of seeing the connected experience, marketing and strategy tend to be at the forefront of that. So I hope that's helpful. I think that is what they've got. So if you all have any other questions after we hang up this call, I'm more than happy to answer them or just even have a conversation. So again, my contact information is on the screen, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate the time and attention. We know it's a crowded time with a lot of demands on people. So we really appreciate you joining us today and hope to see you again soon for another Phase 2 webinar. Have a great day, everybody.